Hey, I'm John Allure. Before you listen to this episode, a couple of things. These are podcasts from the first season of Who Killed Theresa, and they're very raw. They were unedited. I haven't gone back and checked over them. I pondered about whether I should do these. Many people found them, I do, amateurish and kind of not very good, but others really kind of liked that raw nature to them. So I've just released them as they are. Don't come to me asking questions about them. This was an iterative process. So what I thought 7 years ago is not what I believe today. And then on that note, I'll be closing down Who Killed Theresa over the next 6 months. I'll run the remaining of the first season episodes. But I've started a new podcast called Undiluted Hocus Pocus, The Wonder of Problems. We'll talk about puzzles and games, and sometimes we'll talk about unsolved murders and police negligence. And you can find that on Spreaker at Undiluted Hocus Pocus. Also, you can check it out on all your major platforms, Spotify and iTunes, etc. And we'll set up social media pages for it as well. So it's a pretty unique name, Undiluted Hocus Pocus. If you put it into a search engine, I'm sure you'll find us. Thanks for listening, and once again, life isn't fair, justice is blind and dysfunctional, and some cops aren't smart like on television. This is Who Killed Theresa. Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is Who Killed Theresa, and we'll call this one Suspects Part 2 / I'm still waiting for my new hot water heater to be installed. And I want to talk now about an offender from Quebec named Guy Croteau. And to start, to give you some landscape and background on Croteau, I'm just going to read from a Montreal Gazette article by Paul Cherry from August 2013. Convicted killer, sex offender given brief leave. Croteau attends relative's funeral. A convicted killer and sex offender serving a life sentence for murder was recently granted a brief leave from a federal penitentiary so he could attend the funeral of a relative under heavy guard and in restraints. Guy Croteau, 56, convicted in 2004 of first-degree murder in the 1987 death of Sophie Landry, age 17, was recently granted the leave so he could be taken to a funeral home on August 10th. A source within Correctional Services Canada said the leave was carried out without incident. The deceased person's relation to Croteau was redacted from a written summary of the Parole Board of Canada's decision to grant the leave, but the summary states the leave was requested as a compassionate temporary absence, which are normally granted so inmates can attend the funerals of close relatives. The deceased was only referred to in the decision as someone Croteau should consider a model for him to follow if he sets goals towards rehabilitation. The leave was granted under a section of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, which allows for, quote, inmate to be absent from penitentiary escorted by a staff member or other person authorized by the institutional head for medical, administrative, community service, family contact, personal development for rehabilitative purposes, or compassionate reasons, end quote. The conditions set out for the leave indicate Croteau is still considered a very dangerous man. Besides being convicted of killing Landry, a stranger Croteau abducted and raped in 1987 before stabbing her 173 times. He is also serving a concurrent 18-year sentence for sexual assaults on 3 other victims. In one case, in July 1999, Croteau picked up 2 16-year-old girls who were hitchhiking and sexually assaulted both at knife point. In the other sexual assault case, Croteau abducted a 10-year-old girl at knife point in 2000 after pretending he needed her help to look for his lost dog. He sodomized the girl after taking her to a wooded area. A Sûreté de Quebec investigation, dubbed Project Probe, ended with his arrest in 2002 and found Croteau, who was working as a janitor at a high school at the time, was possibly involved in other sexual assaults and abductions on the south shore of Montreal between 1995 and 2000. Landry was abducted from South Shore La Prairie, but Croteau left her body in a cornfield in Saint-Roch-de-Achigan, 40 kilometers north of Montreal. The investigation used DNA found on the clothes of the 10-year-old girl Croteau sodomized to link him to Landry's murder and the assault on the two hitchhikers. The parole decision reveals Croteau is detained at a medium-security penitentiary somewhere in Quebec, and that he collaborates well with corrections staff. But he is still considered a high risk to reoffend with little potential of being paroled, and which won't be an option until sometime after 2027. The decision states Croteau meets regularly with a psychiatrist and psychologist to deal with mental health problems. In 2004, he was diagnosed as suffering from chronic depression. He tried to kill himself in a courtroom after he was convicted of murder, and diagnosed with paranoia. He is also waiting on a waiting list to take part in a program to treat sexual deviance and drug addiction. To address the threat he posed, the parole board ordered that Croteau leave to the funeral home be limited to less than 8 hours, with 30 minutes for lunch. The board also ordered that he be escorted by 2 armed guards at all times and transported in a vehicle used to transfer inmates. The board also required that Croteau be kept in handcuffs and leg shackles while at the funeral home. Considering the measures foreseen to constrain you, your case management team is of the opinion that the risk can be managed adequately during the escorted leave that they recommended, the board noted in its decision. All of the necessary verifications were done relative to the victims, and they raised no particular preoccupation with the leave. So a little background on Sophie Landry, 16-year-old. Yes, she was staying in the South Shore of Montreal, but her parents lived on the island of Montreal, and at the time of her abduction and death, she was staying at a sort of a facility for disturbed juveniles on the South Shore, and she was actually taking the transit system, the subway, to Longueuil, and she was picked up by Croteau in the middle of the night at a Longueuil subway station. Again, the distance of time is great. This is 1987 compared to 1975, the Longueuil case we know the best, where the body of Sharon Pryor was found. But still, something worth just mentioning. Don't want to go without mentioning that. And then the other thing to point out is the age of Guy Croteau. So today he would be 60 years old, and in 1977, sort of the nexus year for all these crimes, he would have been 20 years old, and he was known to frequent Montreal quite a bit. So some things to note about that parole decision from 2013, where he was granted leave to attend a relative's funeral. Some other things that are mentioned in here. He's got a long record, and the first evidence of him being processed in the Canadian criminal justice system goes all the way back to 1983, where he's found with an unregistered gun. In 2002, he's charged with a series of robberies, etc. Also, at the time of the 2000 aggression against the 10-year-old girl, He's with a rape kit in his possession. He's got binding tools, a large knife, and condoms in a bag. And Croteau, the reason I first became aware of him is at the time that they charged him with the murder of Sophie Landry. So this is in the time that it became quite public, right around 2002, is right around the same time that I began investigating Theresa's case. And the Sûreté de Quebec went to quite some efforts to publicize Croteau and to try and see if the public knew of any other aggressions. We know they were looking at aggressions on the South Shore, 95 to 2000, but they really blanketed the Quebec area with a media blitz. Most striking, they showed a photo of Croteau. It's a composite of 10 photos of him, which I'll put on my website. And he looks like 10 completely different creatures. He seems to change his appearance, so he's very good at camouflage and masking himself. Obviously, a deception abductor. See this from the composite photos, but also from the fact that in the 10-year-old girl's case, he used a ruse to try and fool her and to sexually assault her, claiming that he was looking for his lost dog. So he's the type of offender in these cases who I would say is organized, clearly planning if you have binding materials at access in your car. An organized offender who uses abduction and then sexual assault as his modus operandi. And when the police, the SQ put out this, as I said, media blitz to try to find other potential victims, we were struck by one photo in the composite, and it's I guess you'd call it the last photo. There's 5 on the top, 5 on the bottom. Of the 5 on the bottom, it's the one at the bottom right. And that photo, that guy, looked strikingly to us like a former chemistry teacher at Champlain Regional College. Now, this was my first lesson in how not to do investigations. You don't go chasing suspects, but nevertheless, we did it. And for a long time, we were convinced that Guy Croteau was once a school teacher at Champlain College, until we finally tracked down what we thought was an alias in the phone book and phoned up this guy. And of course, from the moment he answered the phone and acknowledged that he had been the chemistry teacher at Champlain College back in the 70s, the jig was up, because of course if he couldn't be Croteau, because Croteau was at that point incarcerated. So that ended that. But it did begin my association with Marc Lepine. At that time, the police had a hotline. And so we phoned in the hotline. I phoned in the hotline. And I was all geared up. I was like, oh, finally we're going to get a hotshot detective who's really going to... Boy, if they're looking for people, have we got a story for them? Because we got 3 unsolved victims. And the guy who actually was heading up the hotline was Marc Lepine. Of course, Marc Lepine, nowadays, is my main contact at the Sûreté de Quebec. He's the head of the Cold Case Bureau. So a long road. At that time, he was just a sort of junior investigator in 2002. He, too, like Eric Latour, who we talked about last episode, was one of the first of the Quebec investigators, homicide investigators, to be groomed by the force to be sent to Quantico, Virginia FBI Academy to study the behavioral sciences, and became eventually somewhat of an expert on the deviant behaviors of sexual offenders. Interesting to note that in the Croteau case, it was DNA that was the linking mechanism for all of this. So they find DNA on the clothing of the 10-year-old girl who's sexually assaulted through the dog ruse, and that DNA is used to link to the Landry murder. The girl stabbed 173 times, and to the other two sexual assaults of the hitchhikers. Interesting that in the time, what it's been, let's call it 15 years since 2002 when the SQ did the media blitz, and to today, nothing else has linked Croteau to any other crime, despite them saying he might be responsible for a series of offenses on the South Shore in 95 to 2000, despite the fact that them reaching out to everybody, including us, after 15 years, not a single case other than the initial 4 cases have linked to Croteau, despite the fact that anybody who engages in this level of premeditation, this level of organization, this level of deception in their crimes, a rape kit, stabbing 173 times, must have a point of origin and a point of acceleration. So it's a logical that they would start with that level of violence. There surely must be other crimes, and certainly I don't believe that Croteau's murder of Landry was his first murder. But that's what you're going to get with the current system. It's the same case that we talked about last episode with Luc Gregoire. Despite polygraphs, was Gregoire ever going to cop to other offenses? What's the leverage? What's the motivation for him to do so when he knows that parole is a distinct possibility, if not possibly unlikely, but a possibility? And this is the case with Croteau. So he's eligible, despite there's the one exception due to the funeral, but as it's stated, he has an option in 2027 to be paroled. Now that may seem like a very long time. It's not. It's only 10 years away. Croteau would be 70 then. What would possibly motivate him to come forward now and say, I did other murders, when he could be released in 10 years? Barring being granted absolute immunity from those crimes, which I don't think I don't think the public would has the appetite for that kind of thing. I am unaware of Quebec law enforcement agencies offering such a deal. I don't have any evidence of it, but needless to say, it's a zero-sum gain. I don't see that there's any advantage gained, particularly from the offender, in confessing to crimes when they have in their pocket the knowledge that they may very likely be released back into the community. Other things to mention of note, goes without saying, this type of offender who plans, who is organized, deception, the use of a vehicle. This is very similar to the crimes we have described from 75 to 81. And as noted in, I believe it was, I said, in 77, he's 20 years old. So perhaps 18 is a little too young to be, I would argue 18, if he was 18 in 1975, he was too young to commit the crime on Sharon Pryor. That seems like the act of a mature criminal, not an 18-year-old. But that's just my opinion. Other thing to note, so Landry's body is dumped north of Montreal in Saint-Roch-de-Achigan. Where is Saint-Roch-de-Achigan? Well, it's about 20 miles from Saint-Calixte, where the victim Jocelyn Houle was found, abandoned by a roadside. It's also very close to the federal penitentiary in Saint-Anne-de-Plain, the Archambault prison where Luc Gregoire was held. Just to say, if you had any experience being processed through the Quebec penitentiary or prison system, you would probably have knowledge of northern the northern region, the regions of Quebec north of Montreal, because that's where its most famous prison is. I believe there's another one up there too. The name escapes me. I want to turn now to two other offenders, and one of the most heinous crimes ever to be committed in Quebec. And the offenders are Gilles Pimpare and Normand Guerrien. And the crime goes like this. In 1979, actually July 3rd, 1979, Pimpare and Guerrien are in the Jacques-Cartier Bridge sector of Montreal. And you know this region because we've talked about it. On the side that the bridge touches Montreal is where the Sûreté de Québec's headquarters are. If you cross the bridge, you cross St. Helens Island and where the amusement park La Ronde was, and just to the south of it where Man in His World was, the World's Fair. And if you go even further, you're then into Longueuil. And if you go just a little bit north of there, you hit the dump site of Sharon Pryor and what we believe to be the body of Joanne Lemieux. So July 3rd, 1979, Guerin and Pimpare are partying, and they are on a binge, and they are wasted. They attack that evening over 9 different people between the ages of 16 and 65. And they're armed with a knife, with a gun, and they rob victims. And 2 of these victims were young women between the ages of 16 and 19, and they're sexually assaulted. Now, through the course of the night, they find themselves on the Jacques-Cartier Bridge, and 2 young people, Chantal Dupont, age 15, and her friend Maurice Marcille, age 14, are returning from a concert at La Ronde, and they're taking the Jacques-Cartier Bridge home to Longueuil. And that's when they encounter Guerrien and Pimpare. The 2 of them take them under the bridge. There's like a walkway under the Jacques-Cartier Bridge there, and they steal their money, which amounts to $2, and they rape Chantal Dupont. Now, in addition to that, the victims are strangled. The girl, Chantal Dupont, is beaten or stepped on. She's fractured. She has her spinal column is severely damaged. And after they're finished with them, they throw both these young children off the Jacques-Cartier Bridge into the St. Lawrence River. The investigator and filmmaker Claude Poirier, journalist who we've talked about before on this program, was asked to comment in a film about these crimes, what he thought of it, and his his take was there should be no mercy for such criminals. The young children, they saw their death come, and I cannot imagine that the parents of these children could forgive these monsters. But nevertheless, that's what the parents of Chantal Dupin did, is they forgave them for these crimes. It became the subject of a film, a Quebec film that was made, I believe, in 1992. It's a documentary called Le Pardon, The Pardon. So yes, Gardien and Pimpare were caught up with and tried and imprisoned very quickly afterwards. And Le Pardon, this movie is quite controversial, with the family finally forgiving the two offenders, particularly Normand Guérin. And in the film, Guérin says, "When I met Chantal, I saw the purity of the girl. I wanted to keep her for myself. I killed her to keep her just for me." And the film bizarrely ends with Guérin at some correctional facility in the arms of the father and mother of Chantal Dupin, and the three of them all sobbing together, saying they offered their daughter to the Lord by forgiving her murderer. So let's talk a little bit about her murderer. And it's pretty well established that Pimpare was the chief aggressor in this affair. Normand Guérin was more of an accomplice. He has been paroled. I think he's out now. I'm not quite sure, but Pimpare for years has been trying to be paroled, but fortunately has been kept incarcerated. So a few things about him. He was criminally active since 1973. He would be 63 years of age today, so that would mean 23 in 1977, 21 in 1975. And certainly with a criminal activity since 1973, a number of delinquencies, including armed robbery, sequestrations, abductions, armed robbery, etc., and of course sexual assaults. So somebody active for that amount of time, I could put them as a suspect in some of the crimes from 75 to, well, till 79, because he's caught in 79. Actually, I'm just going over his file now in French, so forgive me. He actually, his criminal activity, according to the file, begins in 1967. So that would, very young, that would put him at 13. That would put him at the same age that we're told that Luc Gregoire became criminally active. So he's active since 67, and it says that the level of violence that he inflicts against victims gets more and more aggressive from 67 onto his incarceration in 79. It's noted in a psychological evaluation that he has specific paraphilia, although it doesn't go into details. He's antisocial, narcissistic, and psychotic. Now, just this month, we learned that Pimpare has requested parole hearing to be paroled for this is the 7th time that he's requested it. But at the last minute, he postponed it to the despair of the mother of the young boy, Maurice Marcil. His mother, Madeleine Hubert, lives in France, and every time that the hearing is called, she has to make travel arrangements to come from France to Quebec to appear at the hearing in protest. Pimpare has postponed that hearing. He's scheduled it and then postponed it 5 times in the last year. And this is from a TVA article online recently. And just shows her complete despair. Pimpare in the article, actually this is from 2010 when he was asked, he says, "I can reassure society I am convinced that I have no more problems. I settled them all by myself," he says. Not really convincing, Mr. Pimpare. This is far from reassuring for Madeleine Hubert and Nancy Roy, Executive Director of the Association of Family of Assassinated and Missing Persons, AVPAD. Mr. Pimpare has a rate of recidivism and dangerousness far too great for him to be allowed greater rights than the victim, said Nancy Roy. He is a dangerous being who should not be set free. We should immediately refuse the request. So, Gilles Pimpare, criminally active in the Montreal area from 1973 until 1979, certainly a candidate for some of these unsolved cases that we've been discussing. But here's my main reason why despite his protestations, I don't think Mr. Pimpare is ready to be released. If you look at the most recent decision registry from 2014, it gives note to the fact that one of the reasons he shouldn't be let loose is at one time they confiscated his computer, and on it they found a cache of pornographic materials, among other things. So at first glance you say, yeah, so what? What offender doesn't have pornography? But if you dig back to the parole decision on Pimpare from 2001, that report gives more detail on what exactly was confiscated and what was found. And what it says is, in 2000, corrections confiscated his computer and inventoried it, and they found 1,500 pornographic photographs. But more specifically, they found photographs of young women nude near the Jacques Cartier Bridge. So somehow he had managed to get photographs of young women posing nude near the site where he raped and brutally murdered Chantal Dupont. Wanted to keep her for myself, indeed. Wanted to talk about one other case, and that's the relatively recent murder of Natasha Cornoyer by Claude Larouche. And this is from, it's a translation from La Presse on June 28th, 2013. Claude Larouche, the murderer of Natasha Cornoyer, admitted Friday morning in the Superior Court that he had attempted to kill another woman in October 2009. The Crown now wants him to be declared a dangerous offender. The 51-year-old carpenter, who has gained weight since his trial for the murder of Miss Cornoyer 2 years ago, pleaded guilty before Judge Marc-André Blanchard this morning to a charge of attempted murder in the matter of a prostitute named Dominique. The events occurred on October 11th, 2009, 11 days after the death of Natasha Cornoyer, while the murderer of the Cornoyer victim had not yet been identified. Claude Larouche then lived in the Hochelaga neighborhood of Montreal with a spouse and 2 children. On October 11th, 2009, he visited Dominique, who offered her prostitution services in the newspaper. On the spot, LaRouche inquired whether the woman had locked up her dog. After confirming that he was alone with her, he assaulted her and tried to strangle her. Dominique struggled, bit LaRouche, and then managed to escape on the balcony. LaRouche escaped, but left behind his broken glasses, and the DNA left on the glasses allowed authorities to identify him. He was accused in April 2010 of this attempted murder. He was detained since November 2009 because he was charged with the murder of Ms. Cournoyer. Natasha Cournoyer, a 37-year-old civilian employee of the Correctional Services of Canada, was abducted in the parking lot of her work in Laval around 8 p.m. Her body, which showed several traces of violence, was discovered by chance 5 days later in Pointe-aux-Trembles. During the trial, it was established that LaRouche was hunting for a victim on the evening of October 1st, 2009. He had initially decided on a jogger that ran near the wooded area and the parking lot adjacent to the Correctional Services building. He had finally given up and was waiting for another victim. When Madame Cournoyer, at the end of her work at about 8 p.m., crossed the large parking lot to the unlocked car, LaRouche emerged and removed her. During his trial, LaRouche admitted that he had killed Mrs. Cournoyer, but he submitted that he was intoxicated and claimed that he did not want to kill her. On the second day of his deliberations, the jury found him guilty of premeditated murder. It should be noted that in 2003, LaRouche had attempted to kidnap a 9-year-old girl near her school in Montreal. He had been sentenced to 40 months in jail for that offense. Now, I merely bring up LaRouche, don't have a very strong opinion that he's connected to the cases we're talking about. He would have been 15 in 1977, and that's not even old enough to drive. But nevertheless, he is criminally active in 2003 in his 20s. He's attempting early 20s abduction. So he's worth looking at. More to the point, again, I would say this. Again, we see that it's DNA that links the case of the prostitute named Dominique and Natasha Cournoyer. And there was another media blitz in the late 2000s where, again, the Quebec police agencies do another media blitz to see if they can get anything to stick to Claude LaRouche. Does anybody know anything? And of course, nothing comes of that because, as we've said, the only way you're going to hit somebody is through the link of DNA, which, as we've already discussed in the 75 to 81 cases, in the vast majority of those cases, the DNA evidence has been tossed. It's all gone. So what are your other opportunities? Well, somebody coming forward and saying, I know that they did it. Less and less probable as crimes atrophy. Why would you want to put yourself in harm's way or in the bullet sites or even get yourself involved in a criminal justice system that has flagrant systemic flaws and errors? And of course, the last thing is, as we've said, I will beat a dead horse. Confession, but what's going to get? Why on God's earth would Claude LaRouche confess to other crimes? What could he possibly gain from that? Nevertheless, and as we say, it might be a stretch for him to be associated with this 75 to 81 crimes, but there's a whole body of disappearances and murders that I haven't even gone into, and it remains to be seen whether I will go into them. But from the 80s and 90s, what happened to Cédric Provencher? What happened to Melina Martin, Nadine Lucier, Melanie Cabet? Where's Nathalie Goodbeau? Where's Marilyn Bergeron? These are more recent crimes and evidence of abduction. And Claude LaRouche should definitely remain a suspect until he's cleared in any of those investigations. So there you are, lo and behold. I've given you a bonus episode. And just like that, 40 minutes have passed and my hot water heater is installed, so I can go take a shower. In summary, just worth repeating again. DNA is where it's at. DNA is where these crimes are getting solved. But if you toss evidence, you toss out the only viable means for these very old cold cases to find resolution. This has been Who Killed Theresa. I'm glad you listened to the 20th. Yeah, this is our 20th podcast. You can reach me on Twitter at JusticeGuy. That's at JUSTUSGUY. There's also a website where I'll post any visual information that might be relative to the topics we talked about today. That's at theresallore.com, TheresaAllore.com. There's also, if you go on there, since we talked about Claude LaRouche, to the right panel, there's a pages section, and there's a page marked maps, crime scene maps. But I think it's in French. I think it says carte de crime. And if you click on that, it'll take you to a series of maps. More importantly, there's a map on there about all of Claude LaRouche's activities in 2007, 2008. And then it also geographically locates where various unsolved disappearances or murders, where the points of disappearance of those young women occurred. There's a Facebook page. Just search on Who Killed Theresa, the podcast on Facebook. You should be able to pull it up. If you follow it, I will occasionally post things of narrative and visual relevance rather than oral irrelevance. I think that's it. There's a bunch of other ways to contact me, but you know the drill now, I think. No use repeating it. So that's the podcast, and have yourself a great, great afternoon.